This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm very delighted that from Jerusalem, I am joined today by Professor Guy Laron. He's a historian, Israeli historian, and tracks the area and the region and what's happening here very closely. I want to discuss a whole range of issues with him today, but I want to begin with one particular issue, which is the context of this conflict with Iran. Professor, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I want to begin by asking you, while all of this is happening, and now, of course, the war with Iran and Israel and America is in ceasefire mode, there is a wider context. At the same time that this conflict is happening, there's a huge effort to build something called IMEC, this transnational corridor that is supposed to revolutionize trade, connecting the West, the Mediterranean, and India, almost in a manner that they used to be in ancient times, to revisit almost that level of connectivity, trade, and commerce. What happens to all those plans, considering what's going on at the moment in Iraq? And of course, we'll come to the Gaza story in a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a very important background story, which is rarely discussed and even more rarely connected to the current conflicts in the Middle East. Because most commentators and pundits would start the story on 7 October 2023 when Hamas attacks Israel. But there was something that preceded that. And that was the press conference during the G20 summit in New Delhi, right? When President Biden announced the initiative to create a trade corridor from India to Europe through the Arabian Peninsula and Israel. So this was an opening salvo in a struggle to shape the trade corridors of Eurasia. And it was the first time that the United States presented a coherent plan to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative that aims to create trade corridors that are completely under Chinese control, built by China, operated by China. The projects themselves get loans from China. So that was the first time that the United States presented a coherent plan of its own. And moreover, I mean, in my reading, it was also an initiative to try to detach India from an emerging Eurasian trade bloc that will include China and Russia, obviously, North Korea, and Iran. But, you know, if India becomes part of that, that's a game changer. So what Biden announced was a way to create an incentive for the Indian economy to become more integrated into European markets. That dovetails also with the Narendra Modi's initiative of Made in India, making India a manufacturing hub that would compete with China, right? And that naturally, that would orient the Indian economy towards European markets. So the Biden initiative was, you know, all those things rolled into one. And the response was by Hamas was to attack because, you know, Hamas may not care about trade corridors, but it did care that part of the American initiative included an Israeli-Saudi normalization. And they immediately grasped in Gaza, and we know it from Hamas documents that the Israeli army captured in Gaza, that was the trigger. I mean, the plan was there. The date was debatable at the time, but once they've heard that Saudi-Israeli normalization was about to materialize, they decided that they needed to preempt, derail the normalization before it happened, okay? And that started us on, the kind of storm we're still in, right? In the Middle East. But, in the background, that question always lingers, whether, when the dust settles and, Iran and Iran's proxies are weakened and degraded, whether the United States will be able to, advance this initiative. And in some ways, it already has. Well, things are happening so fast, it's hard to remember. But Trump was in the region, just last month in May, and he announced $2 trillion deals with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And how is it relevant to IMEC? Because it complemented the press conference that Trump did with Modi in February, right? Modi was in Washington in February. And then during the press conference, Trump talked about that IMEC would include undersea cables, many, many undersea cables, he said. Okay, what would they connect? Okay, so we got the answer in May this year that they would connect India with huge data centers, 3 gigawatt of data centers eventually, powering all sorts of AI applications. And so that would sit in the Gulf. It would burn oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, right? Because it necessitates a lot of electricity. But these data centers were, first off, would be connected to all the back office services that Indian, companies give for Western corporations. So that's an important note in the whole IMEC scheme. So it's not just a trade corridor; it's also a digital trade corridor. So, so all these things are happening in parallel to the wars, and in a way, there's a synergy here. In order to create the trade corridor, secure it, and build it, you also have to parry pressures from rivals and enemies.
Talk to us a little bit about this is very insightful, Professor. Talk to us a little bit about where you see this go from now. Now that this conflict has unfolded, there is a conflict still going on in Gaza. There
Right.
is some sort of a ceasefire at the moment between Israel and Iran. Considering all of these things, considering that none of this is over, in fact, so many would say far from over, where do you see this ambitious plan go from now? How do you think this will develop? Because the interest, certainly from the Indian side, and I think also from the United States side, is still quite strong. But how do you think this will evolve?
Well, so the Cold War between the United States and China is still ongoing. There's also a trade war between the US and China. So each superpower would continue to reshape the trade infrastructure of the Middle East in particular, but also of Eurasia in general. I think Trump is thinking about spheres of influence, okay? But I mean, my impression he would like India to be in the US and the EU's sphere of influence. And then if you think about it through these lens, then the logical step after the Iran-Israel conflict, and after it ended, I think, with very definite results, which is, it seems that large parts of the Iranian nuclear project were destroyed. The Iranian program was degraded. And that's off the table for the foreseeable future. Also, Iran is exposed. Anything they'll try to do uh, can be seen by Israeli and American intelligence satellites. So if that's the case, Iran doesn't have a lot of options to rebuild. So, and also Iran paid a heavy price for all its proxy strategy. So there's a good chance they won't come back to that. And Iran would focus more on, its own internal needs and affairs and less about trying to maintain its regional dominance. And if that would unfold, then the logical step would be to renew the normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So you have like a Persian Gulf India leg already emerging. So what you need to do is continue the trade corridor towards the Gulf of Haifa in Israel. So you have to settle the Gaza conflict somehow, and then return back to the question of Israeli-Saudi normalization. So I think the Israeli right thought that, Israel got a win against Iran, and then they can resume their settlement project in the West Bank. So the war is about Israel shaping the region to agree to its settlement policy in the West Bank and maybe in Gaza as well. But if you look at it from an American perspective, no, the war enables a different scenario in which Israel has to, shelve some of its settlement plans and think seriously how it creates an enduring arrangement, perhaps a peace settlement, perhaps an interim agreement with the Palestinians. I will not be surprised at all, although, right now it looks far-fetched after so much bloodshed and violence and destruction that there would be peace talks in the Middle East. But that's how all wars end eventually, right?
Let's talk a little bit about the Abraham Accords because you mentioned it, Professor. There have been consistent, in the last few hours especially, consistent voices of hope, should I say, especially from America, that indeed the time has come once again, perhaps because of this ceasefire and because of the vastly depleted threat that Iran now poses, not just to Israel, but to other sort of adversaries or rivals in the broader Gulf region, that the moment perhaps has emerged once again that the Abraham Accords could be re-triggered and, taken to their rightful conclusion. Are you hopeful that that will happen?
Yes, I think so. You can talk about the Western Persian Gulf states, which include Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. And they have an Iran problem, okay? They have a strong neighbor with expansionist aims. They do not want to stand in Iran's crosshairs. And they lack significant military capacities, those Persian Gulf countries. So one way to solve the problem is to have a security umbrella, okay? And since the American security umbrella was lacking, okay, was shown as lacking in 2019 when Iran attacked Saudi Arabia, then allying with Israel as a regional hegemon made sense, okay? I think like in the last 2 or 3 years, there was another strategy that was pursued at the same time that was also to try to reconcile with Iran. And you've seen that. I mean, there was the Chinese mediated this kind of peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year. And so that was another way to solve the problem. to get closer to Iran and cooperate with it. Now, after the war ended, there seems less of a reason for doing so, and Israel can, answer needs that JCC countries have in several ways. I mean, it can be Israel can be part of IMEC. It can be a conduit to transfer oil from the Persian Gulf to Europe. There's an existing infrastructure. There's an Israeli pipeline from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean in use, and it has spare capacity that can be used to increase the transfer of oil through that pipeline. And also, since we know that Gulf states want to be a part of the emerging artificial intelligence economy. That was the meaning of the Trump visit. And in fact, both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been lobbying for the past 2 or 3 years to get access to advanced microchips. Okay, Biden didn't agree to sell it to them, and Trump did. That's what happened in May. That was when he gave the final approval, and the Commerce Department issued a statement saying that now these advanced AI-enabling microchips would be sold to the United Arab Emirates and to Saudi Arabia. So once they have that capacity, those data centers, I think it's only natural that there would be a technological cooperation with Israel. I mean, Israel has the know-how. Israel has the manpower to help countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, not just to have those data centers, but to use them and build upon them to create high-tech industry in the Gulf. So, so in terms of energy, security, and technology, going back to the Abraham Accords, build upon them, and expand cooperation makes a lot of sense, theoretically. It depends, of course, what kind of government you have in Israel and how open it is to that. But that opportunity is definitely there.
Let's talk a little bit also about the situation in Gaza, Professor. Obviously, conflicting reports consistently emerge every single day about what the situation is there. Talk to me a little bit about your assessment of what is the end game here, because there are voices even from within Israel who are now sort of suggesting that perhaps, there are political ideals that have got mixed up in this conflict now, and perhaps some of that could be restrained even from the Israeli side. And indeed, the other crisis is that Hamas is perhaps not 100% eliminated. Perhaps it'll never be 100% eliminated. So it's difficult for the outside world to understand what's going on. Could you shed some light?
Right. So, once the 7 October attack happened, there was a consensus in Israel that the time for a military action has arrived. There were various calls throughout the last 2 decades in Israel to invade Gaza and obliterate Hamas infrastructure in order to maintain the security of Israel in its southern parts, in the Negev. And each time the judgment call of the cabinet was that the price in human lives is too steep. Okay? So that obviously changed after 7 October. The calculus has changed. And Israeli land forces entered Gaza in a big way and created a lot of destructions and human suffering. And in the first few months of the campaign, the feeling in Israel was that this is a necessary price, considering how awful and catastrophic was the Hamas attack. But as we continued from 7 October and we moved from 23 to 24, the doubting voices in the Israeli public increased. And again, the opposition movement asked, why not finish the war with a settlement? Okay? And in this settlement, Israeli forces would withdraw from Gaza because there's no intrinsic value for Israel in staying there and becoming involved in a kind of a guerrilla quagmire that would, cause the killing of Israeli soldiers. And that has been happening, by the way. The world's attention was to Iran, but each week, probably 3 to 4 Israeli soldiers are getting killed in Gaza. So, and just yesterday, 7 more Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza. So the Israeli public's attention is redrawn to that question. And of course, another question that came up, why not use the Palestinian Authority as a political entity that would enter Gaza? You said yourself, Hamas is not eliminated. Okay, but who knows how to, not eliminate Hamas, but disarm Hamas, okay? It's a movement, it's a party, and as such, the civilian wing of Hamas is a legitimate entity. But, the problem is with the military wing. So who better to deal with that problem than the Palestinian Authority that is more moderate and was always for reaching a territorial settlement with Israel. So that option remains. I don't think the current government is very much open to that. But either under American pressure or because Netanyahu, the prime minister, would decide that it is in his interest, a new election in Israel can bring to power a new government with a new policy that would pursue exactly the same recipe that I have described, which is to use the Palestinian Authority to end the conflict in Gaza and, of course, remove Israeli forces from Gaza. It's hard to believe right now that something like that can happen because we're still stuck in the horrific stage of this conflict. But again, any war eventually ends in a settlement. And I think the visions of the Israeli extreme right about Gaza, which is to annex it and sell it, I think these remain fantasies to which the majority of Israelis do not agree. And also the international community will never accept it and will create counter pressure on Israel to stop it. So the possibility that we will see a different future for Gaza remains, and I think we should maintain our hopes.
The other question that, of course, is in everyone's mind, Professor, is that one of the reasons why Hamas was what it was is because, as you have also said in the course of this conversation, it was an Iranian proxy, and all of these groups received significant support from Iran. Now that Iran is vastly depleted, some even may question how long the incumbent regime in Iran will last, even if it lasts, in what shape and form it will last. Now that it is vastly depleted, do you think the situation in Gaza among the people who are sort of creating this sort of atmosphere of conflict, do you think that will change in some way? Does Israel have any hope that because Iran is depleted so significantly, some things will inevitably change in the Palestinian territories, in fact, in Gaza?
Yeah, I think the main thing you're pointing to is the question, will Iran continue to fund, equip, and train proxy militias in the Middle East? We can imagine a future in which Iran would petition this policy, and I'll say exactly why. I mean, it might not happen tomorrow. It might happen gradually, rather than suddenly. But I think there'll be a debate in Tehran about how effective the proxy strategy was, why it seemed to have collapsed, that the proxy strategy, well, it brought war into Iran rather than defend it, and it was ineffectual in the current war. So, and another thing I think that we need to think about, consider, is that probably Iran would be more dependent on China. I think that's a very reasonable scenario to consider. Russia is a spent force, and it's a major Iranian ally. But I don't think that Russia has the capacity to take over Iran and help it rebuild. China has that capacity. And then we should ask whether the Chinese have an interest in Iran continuing its proxy strategy. And I'm not sure that the Chinese like this idea. I think they would prefer stability. They're a trading nation, they're a
No, this
manufacturing
is
nation.
exactly right. Because, I mean, if China gets embroiled in rebuilding Iran, just as a hypothetical question, as you put it, it also means that a lot of Chinese attention or a significant amount will have to move from the Indo-Pacific. And of course, what China really wants is Taiwan, and it really wants to, in a sense, face off with the United States and the Indo-Pacific and so on and so forth. So obviously, you're absolutely right. They would not want to get embroiled in rebuilding Iran. But how do you see the China, Iran, and as an Indian, I must say also Pakistan in between, this relationship play out in the coming years and months?
Well, China, but it's for me, from my own vantage point, also because I'm interested in those questions, it's all about energy, right? Because China has huge energy needs. It has, by the way, maybe not a lot of viewers are aware of it. The China Oil Company, the name eludes me, but it's one of the biggest energy companies in the world. Also, one of the biggest companies, one of the top 10 companies in the world. But China can't supply its energy needs by its own. I think Iran supplies about 14% of the oil that China consumes, which is considerable. So, in order to secure its energy supply, China would, I think, naturally would be sucked into trying to help Iran rebuild and reconstruct. As a superpower, it also has an interest, to carve its own sphere of influence. Iran can be a very useful part of the trade corridor, okay, from China to Europe, okay, one that connects eventually to Turkey and creates a land bridge between Europe and China. So that's part of the map that you described. Another one is Pakistan. So there are all sorts of reasons for China to be involved in Pakistan, but one of the biggest is China's energy security. Okay, so if you want to ask if China is truly a superpower, I would say that China's ambitions to become a superpower are stuck in the Malacca Straits because, in any future conflict, step number one on the chessboard of the United States, I think also of the Indian Navy, is to block the Malacca Strait. Once you do that, you cut off China's oil supply. So Pakistan, in a way, is seen in Chinese eyes as the answer. You have the Gaza port, right? And they're trying unsuccessfully so far. The Chinese are trying to build this axis from Gaza into China and thereby create energy stability. So instead of importing through the Malacca Straits, you would bring the tankers to Gaza and from there to China, okay? Maybe it can't replace the passage through the Malacca Straits completely, but then again, it's much better than a complete economic standstill as it is now, if you cut off Chinese access to the Malacca Straits. So I think part of the answer why China would be, dragged into greater involvement in Iran and why it is already very much involved in Pakistani affairs is to ensure its energy security, to ensure its energy independence. This is where China remains much more vulnerable than its rival, the United States, which is now a major energy exporter.
No, this is of course a very critical point. One of the reasons the Chinese are developing their naval power in such a historic way is because they really want to, in a sense, face off not only with America, but also with India and guardrail the routes that bring them energy. And of course, Iran being one of their primary, most important sources of energy. How do you see this pan out for Iran? It is vastly depleted. The regime is depleted. Do you think there could be internal turbulence there that could affect a regime change?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So most Iran watchers and Iran analysts, some of them are Iranian themselves, in the West, that's the people I'm reading, they don't see, the kind of, Soviet Union style collapse in which you get an entirely different regime and an entirely different composition of social forces governing in Iran, but rather the growing power of the military establishment and the revolutionary guards in Iran, making Iran more insular, okay, less invested in regional politics, and more governed by the needs of the military establishment. And that, in that sense, it would resemble more, say, Pakistan, okay, rather than this dominant Middle Eastern force that Iran hoped to become. And, Iran was on a bad trajectory, on a bad long-term trajectory even before this war. Well-known fact, its fertility rate was going down, major problems in the economy with inflation and unemployment, state capacity to provide social services was deteriorating. We know about electricity blackouts, and we also know about growing weakness to supply water, which, if you don't have electricity, you'll also have problem of pumping the waters. They have a growing problem of desertization. The desert is growing. There are more droughts. So all that points to a country that would tend more to its internal problems, just, to remain with a grip on power and a hold on the population, and Iran becoming more and more dependent the regime in Iran becoming more and more dependent on external support, with the most obvious patron being China.
My last question, Professor, which is let's focus on Israel, since you are speaking to me from Israel. One of the things that has been apparent also with Israel in this conflict is as strong as Israel is, when this kind of conflict arises on multiple fronts, after all, it's a small country. It does get stretched, and even its defenses, formidable as they are, also get stretched. As, for instance, as they say, you can stop 99 missiles, but one missile might still get through and land. Now, this obviously happened this time with attacks on Jerusalem and on Tel Aviv and so on and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about where Israel goes from here. Of course, the good news is that one of its key adversaries, in a sense, to a degree, at least for the time being, has been, stalled and neutralized. But the conflict in Gaza is very much on, and some of the wider sort of problems with the Palestinians obviously are still very much on. Then the other problematic thing that the world notices is that in many Western capitals now, there are, leaders emerging. And I'm thinking at the moment, for instance, because we're talking today of Zoran Mamdani in New York, who's just been, made Democratic with the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party candidate for the mayoral elections. Now, the question and who's very virulently for the Palestinian cause and is against Israel. So when all of this, and you saw what happened in academia, since you're from academia yourself, with all these problems cropping up, how do you see the state of Israel negotiating this perilous path in the months and years to come? What would be the strategy? How do you see it?
So that's a great question. I think you can sum up Israeli politics, certainly in the last 2 to 3 decades, as an ongoing discussion about the annexation of the West Bank. And the major argument of the Israeli right, which Benjamin Netanyahu personifies, is that the Israeli left is too pessimistic, that the occupation and the annexation of the West Bank is doable. You can do peace with the Arab world without a settlement of the Palestinian issue. Israel's economy is growing nicely with a strong emphasis on high-tech industry that pulls the entire economy forward. And despite some doomsaying from the Israeli left, relations with Europe are intact, and the alliance with the United States is as strong as ever. Okay. And then October 2023 comes along. And it turns out there is a price, okay? And on various levels and in various ways, the cost of continuing that nationalist project in the West Bank becomes very, very clear, okay? And, there was a rapid turn of events, and also it takes some time for people to comprehend, to understand and digest, okay? But I think these things are happening, and I think if Israel will have fair and free elections in the coming cycle, I think you will see a different government, a government more willing to compromise, maybe not go all the way to a Palestinian state, but certainly make some concessions, including territorial ones. But that's, I think the world will have to be patient as Israel debates this. But this would take place within the next year or two. I think you will see an Israel that is more cost aware than it was before, less sure of itself, and less vain.
On that optimistic note, thanks very much, Professor Guy Laron. Thanks for joining me from Israel today. I really appreciate your time. No doubt, as this story evolves, we'll have more opportunities to connect with you and have conversations about the future. Of course, for all such conversations, all you need to do is click on the bell icon and join the universe of Global Order, where we have some of the finest people, finest minds from around the world discussing the issues that matter. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks so much.